Welcome back to Black Discoveries. Today, we embark on a powerful and emotional journey through a dark chapter in human history, slavery. This documentary aims to shed light on the origins, expansion, and unimaginable hardships endured by enslaved people. Join us as we explore the historical context, complexities, and lasting impact of slavery on society. The Colonial Era. Before the arrival of European explorers, the land that is now the United States was home to diverse Native American populations for thousands of years. While Jamestown, Virginia, established in 1607, is often cited as the first European settlement in what is now the United States, it is important to acknowledge that St. Augustine, Florida, founded by the Spanish in 1565, holds the distinction of being the oldest continuously inhabited city in the United States. A common misconception is that the first Africans to arrive in what is now America were enslaved people brought by the British to Jamestown in 1619. However, historical records show that there were already black people living in Florida as free individuals long before this happened. These people, known as Maroons, were runaway enslaved Africans who formed settlements in the Americas, especially in Florida, as early as the 16th century. They fought against enslavement throughout the colonial period. These Africans, who arrived in Florida before it was even established, were slaves who had escaped from earlier conquerors and fled into the wilderness. They had many settlements along the coastal islands of the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida. When the first Spanish bricks were laid in St. Augustine, the practice of enslaving people from Africa had begun in the Iberian Peninsula, the modern-day countries of Spain and Portugal, centuries before the conquistadors arrived in the Americas. By the time of the Spanish colonization of the Americas, Africans had been living in the Iberian Peninsula for over half a century. The first enslaved Africans were brought to the Iberian Peninsula by Arab traders in the 8th century. Over time, the slave trade became increasingly common, and by the 15th century, it was a major economic activity in the region. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to engage in the large-scale importation of enslaved Africans from Africa. This practice commenced in 1444 and swiftly evolved into a lucrative enterprise. By the 16th century, the Portuguese were transporting tens of thousands of enslaved Africans annually to Europe and the Americas. Embracing this practice, the Spanish also began importing enslaved Africans from Africa in substantial numbers during the early 16th century. By the time the Spanish conquistadors arrived, Africans had been present in Spain for over half a century. In 1513, two main groups of people of African descent arrived in St. Augustine, free black individuals, either born in Spain or Portugal or previously enslaved and later freed. Driven by the desire for new opportunities, these individuals brought valuable skills such as carpentry, farming, and blacksmithing to the Spanish colonists. Enslaved black individuals brought to Florida by the Spanish, forced to labor on plantations and other labor-intensive jobs, often subjected to harsh treatment and abuse. Both groups played a crucial role in St. Augustine's development. The free black community contributed to the city's growth and economic prosperity, while the enslaved black population provided the essential labor that sustained the city. Key details about the people of African descent who arrived in St. Augustine in 1513. Originating from various African countries, including Senegal, Gambia, and Angola, these individuals brought diverse cultures and traditions. They spoke a variety of African languages, including Wolof, Mandinka, and Yoruba. Their religious beliefs encompassed a range of traditions, including Islam, Christianity, and traditional African religions. The Maroons. Maroons, who were runaway enslaved Africans, often formed alliances with Native Americans to fight against the Spanish and British colonists in Florida. These alliances proved to be a constant threat to the colonial powers and played a significant role in shaping the region's history. Maroon communities in Florida typically established themselves in remote areas such as swamps and forests. They subsisted on the land, possessing exceptional skills in hunting, fishing, and farming. Additionally, they were renowned for their fighting prowess, often armed with guns and machetes and adept at guerrilla warfare. Despite their diverse origins and varying customs, Maroons in Florida were united by their shared experience of enslavement and their unwavering pursuit of freedom. They represented a formidable force, leaving an indelible mark on Florida's history and continuing to inspire generations today. Here are some of the most notable Maroon settlements in Florida. Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mos, founded in 1738 by Spanish slaves. This settlement was situated near St. Augustine and holds the distinction of being the first legally recognized free black settlement in North America. Fort Matanzas, constructed by Spanish colonists in 1742 to safeguard St. Augustine from British attacks. This fort also served as a refuge for escaped slaves. Black Seminole. This group of Maroons emerged from the collaboration between escaped slaves and Seminole Indians. They fiercely resisted the United States government during the Seminole Wars. The Everglades Maroons. These Maroons made their home in the Everglades swamps of Florida and successfully evaded capture by the United States government. Origins. Slavery was a terrible practice that existed in America for a very long time, about 200 years. It began in the early 1700s when the first Africans were brought to the British colonies in North America. Over the next 250 years, millions of Africans were captured and forced to travel across the Atlantic Ocean to be enslaved. When the Africans arrived in what is now Virginia in 1619, they were not called slaves right away. They were called indentured servants. This was a way of trying to hide the fact that they were being forced to work without pay. In the middle of the 17th century, a new system called the plantation system was created in the South. These were large farms that grew things like cotton, rice, and tobacco. Enslaved people were forced to work on these plantations. The plantation system made the South very rich, but it was very unfair to the enslaved people. How it started. Slavery dates back to prehistoric times and was apparently modeled on the domestication of animals. From the earliest periods of recorded history, slavery was found in the world's most advanced regions. The earliest civilizations along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia, the Nile in Egypt, the Indus Valley of India, and China's Yangtze River Valley had slavery. The earliest known system of laws, the Hammurabi Code, recognized slavery. But the percentage of slaves in these early civilizations was small, in part because male war captives were typically killed, while women were enslaved as field laborers or concubines. The first known slavery. In August 1619, enslaved Africans arrived in Jamestown, Virginia, on a Dutch ship called the White Lion. At first, these people were treated as indentured servants, meaning they had to work for a set period of time before they could become free. But as time went on and more enslaved Africans were brought to America, the laws changed and the treatment of enslaved people became much harsher. Enslaved people were no longer seen as indentured servants, but as property that could be bought, sold, and traded. This was called chattel slavery. The Transatlantic slave trade, a triangular trade route between Europe, Africa, and the Americas, was responsible for bringing millions of enslaved Africans to America. This trade had a huge impact on American history. How they were shipped from Europe to Africa. European ships sailed from ports in Europe with goods such as textiles, firearms, and other manufactured products. These goods were exchanged for enslaved Africans on the West African coast. From Africa to the Americas, the Middle Passage. The enslaved Africans were then transported across the Atlantic in the infamous Middle Passage. Packed tightly into the holds of slave ships, the conditions on these voyages were deplorable. Enslaved individuals endured overcrowded, unsanitary conditions, limited food and water, and exposure to diseases. Mortality rates were tragically high during this part of the journey. From the Americas to Europe. Once in the Americas, the enslaved individuals were sold to European colonists in exchange for products like sugar, tobacco, cotton, and other commodities. These products were then transported back to Europe, completing the triangular trade. The Middle Passage. The Middle Passage, the leg of the journey from Africa to the Americas, was a harrowing experience for the enslaved individuals. Conditions on the slave ships were brutal, and the voyage could last for several weeks. Enslaved people were tightly packed into the ship's holds, chained together, and subjected to inhumane treatment. Disease, malnutrition, and the harsh conditions led to a significant loss of life during this part of the transatlantic journey. What they went through. Capture and transportation. Enslaved Africans were often captured through raids, wars, or sometimes sold by other Africans. The journey to the coast involved long marches where many endured physical abuses and witnessed the separation from their families and communities. The Middle Passage. Overcrowded conditions. Enslaved individuals were crammed into the holds of slave ships, often in conditions far below any humane standard. Chains and restraints. They were shackled in irons, sometimes restrained in painful positions for the entirety of the journey. Disease and malnutrition. The unsanitary conditions, coupled with limited food and water, led to the rapid spread of diseases, resulting in high mortality rates. Violence and brutality. Cruelty and violence were common, with punishments ranging from whipping to more severe forms of physical abuse. Dehumanization. Enslaved people were often treated as mere commodities, stripped of their humanity and subjected to humiliation. Loss and grief. Families were torn apart as individuals from various regions and communities were often mixed together on the slave ships. Many individuals experienced profound grief and loss as they were forcibly separated from their loved ones, and the uncertainty of their fate loomed. Arrival in the Americas. Sale and auction. Upon arrival in the Americas, enslaved Africans were subjected to the traumatic experience of being sold at auctions. Families were often further separated during this process. Forced labor. Those who survived the Middle Passage were forced into a life of brutal labor on plantations, mines, and other harsh environments. Daily life. Under enslavement, harsh working conditions, enslaved individuals endured grueling work under the constant threat of punishment. Physical and sexual abuse. Many suffered physical and sexual abuse at the hands of slaveholders. Restrictions on freedom. Enslaved people had little to no personal freedom, with strict regulations on their movements, education, and social interactions. Resistance and resilience. Despite these horrific conditions, enslaved individuals demonstrated incredible resilience. Acts of resistance, ranging from subtle forms of defiance to organized rebellions, were evident throughout history. Where they were mainly shipped to. Enslaved Africans during the transatlantic slave trade were shipped to various destinations in the Americas. The primary regions that received the largest numbers of enslaved individuals included the Caribbean islands. The Caribbean was a major destination for enslaved Africans. Islands such as Jamaica, Barbados, Haiti, and Cuba became significant hubs for sugar, coffee, and tobacco plantations, where enslaved labor was extensively utilized. North America, United States. Enslaved Africans were transported to the English colonies in North America, particularly in the southern regions such as Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia. The demand for labor on tobacco and later cotton plantations drove the use of enslaved workers. South America, countries in South America, including Brazil, received a large number of enslaved Africans. Brazil, in particular, became one of the largest importers of enslaved people in the Americas. Central America. Enslaved individuals were also transported to Central American regions, including countries such as Colombia and Honduras. Spanish America. Spanish colonies in the Americas, including present-day Mexico, Peru, and Ecuador, were recipients of enslaved Africans who were forced to work in various industries. West Indies. The West Indies, comprising the islands of the Caribbean, received a significant influx of enslaved Africans. These islands were important in the production of sugar, and the labor-intensive sugar plantations drove the demand for enslaved workers. The profitability of the transatlantic slave trade was substantial and played a crucial role in the economic development of European nations, as well as the growth of industries in the Americas. The profitability was driven by several factors. how profitable it was. Labor-intensive agriculture. Enslaved Africans were primarily used as labor on plantations cultivating cash crops such as sugar, tobacco, cotton, and indigo. The labor-intensive nature of these crops required a large workforce, making enslaved individuals valuable for plantation owners. High demand for goods. The crops produced by enslaved labor, especially sugar and tobacco, had high demand in European markets. The profits generated from the sale of these goods contributed significantly to the wealth of European nations. Emergence of industries. The wealth derived from the slave trade helped finance industrialization in Europe. It played a role in the growth of industries such as shipping, manufacturing, and finance. Triangle trade system. The transatlantic slave trade was part of a broader system known as the Triangle Trade. European ships would transport goods to Africa, exchange them for enslaved Africans, and then transport the enslaved individuals to the Americas, where they would be traded for commodities like sugar and tobacco. These commodities were then transported back to Europe. This triangular route allowed for continuous trade, ensuring a steady flow of profits. Slave auctions and markets. The sale of enslaved individuals at auctions in the Americas was a profitable venture. Plantation owners and traders could purchase labor for their enterprises, contributing to the economic success of the slaveholding class. Legal and financial infrastructure. The profitability was supported by legal systems that upheld the institution of slavery, protecting the rights of slaveholders. Financial institutions were involved in financing the slave trade and ensuring the valuable cargo, contributing to the financial infrastructure supporting the trade. Cheap labor, enslaved labor, was seen as a cost-effective and, from the perspective of slaveholders, a seemingly inexhaustible workforce. The dehumanization of enslaved individuals contributed to the perpetuation of their exploitation as a source of cheap labor. While the transatlantic slave trade was economically profitable for European nations and those involved in the trade, it is important to emphasize the immense human cost and suffering endured by the millions of enslaved individuals. The profitability of the trade was built on the dehumanization, exploitation, and forced labor of those who were enslaved. The long-term consequences of this historical injustice continue to shape social, economic, and cultural dynamics in affected regions. Historical records indicate that some African tribes and kingdoms were involved in facilitating the transatlantic slave trade by collaborating with European slave traders. It's crucial to recognize the complex dynamics at play during this period, as not all African societies participated in or benefited from the slave trade, and many resisted it. Dutch involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. Dutch West India Company. The Dutch were active participants in the transatlantic slave trade through their chartered company, the Dutch West India Company, WIC. The WIC played a significant role in establishing and maintaining trade links between the Netherlands, West Africa, and the Americas. Slave trading forts. The Dutch established trading forts along the West African coast, including Fort Elmina in present-day Ghana. These forts served as centers for the exchange of goods, including enslaved individuals, between African traders and European merchants. Caribbean and South America. Dutch involvement extended to the Caribbean and South America, where they established colonies such as Suriname and Dutch Guiana. Enslaved Africans were forced to work on plantations producing sugar, coffee, and other commodities. Participation in the Triangle Trade. Like other European nations, the Dutch participated in the triangular trade system. European ships would transport goods, weapons, textiles, etc. to Africa, where they were exchanged for enslaved individuals. The ships then sailed to the Americas, where the enslaved individuals were sold for products like sugar and tobacco, which were transported back to Europe. Freed slaves. Self-purchase. Some enslaved individuals managed to buy their freedom by saving money over time or engaging in economic activities during their limited free time. This was more feasible in regions where enslaved individuals had some degree of autonomy. Manumission, or the act of slave owners granting freedom to enslaved individuals, occurred in various places and periods. It could be motivated by a variety of factors, including benevolence, religious convictions, or personal relationships. Military service. In some cases, enslaved individuals were promised freedom in exchange for military service. This was notably practiced during the American Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, where both the British and Americans offered freedom to enslaved individuals who fought on their side. Legal actions, changes in laws, and legal challenges contributed to the emancipation of some enslaved individuals. Abolitionist movements and legal reforms in different countries played a role in the gradual dismantling of the institution of slavery. Escaping to free territories. Some enslaved individuals managed to escape to regions or territories where slavery was not legally recognized or was less enforced. This included fugitives reaching free states in the United States or escaping to territories where European powers had abolished slavery. Abolitionist efforts. Abolitionist movements gained momentum in the 18th and 19th centuries, advocating for the end of slavery. Their efforts, both on moral and humanitarian grounds, contributed to the eventual abolition of slavery in various parts of the world. The Abolitionist Movement. Abolitionists believed that slavery was morally wrong and that everyone should be free. The abolitionist movement was a long and difficult struggle that took decades to finally end in the United States. The 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, ratified in 1865, outlawed slavery nationwide. The abolitionist movement began in the early 1800s with the work of William Lloyd Garrison and other abolitionists. Garrison founded the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1833. The society published an abolitionist newspaper. Notable abolitionists. In Britain, William Wilberforce played a key role in the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in 1807. Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave who became a prominent abolitionist. Douglass advocated for the end of slavery through his writings and speeches. Harriet Tubman, born into slavery, escaped to freedom in the North using the network of anti-slavery activists and safe houses known as the Underground Railroad. Sojourner Truth, born into slavery, escaped to freedom in the North and became a women's rights activist and a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Angelina Grimke, an abolitionist, feminist, and writer. John Brown. While controversial, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859 was an attempt to incite a slave rebellion and hasten the end of slavery. The abolitionist movement grew in size and influence throughout the 19th century. Abolitionists organized boycotts of goods produced by slave labor. They also helped to pass laws that restricted the slave trade and protected the rights of free blacks. The rise of abolitionism. The rise of abolitionism was fueled by a number of factors, including the Second Great Awakening, a religious revival that emphasized the importance of social reform, the growing popularity of democratic ideals, such as the belief that all people are created equal, the increasing awareness of the brutality of slavery. Impact. Slavery shaped the political, social, and economic climate of the United States for centuries as a fundamental institution. Racial inequality, discriminatory policies, and the continuous fight for racial justice are all examples of how the legacy of slavery still permeates American culture today. Economic disparities. The legacy of slavery is the direct cause of the economic divide that exists between white and black Americans. People who were enslaved were deprived of the chance to amass riches or develop assets, which left them severely short of money after they were freed. Discriminatory practices and laws like redlining and unequal access to jobs and education have made this legacy worse. Black Americans face significant economic disparities compared to white Americans. According to the Federal Reserve's 2022 Survey of Consumer Finances, the median net worth for black households is $17,150, compared to $121,000 for white households. This represents a staggering gap of 86.6%. Wide-ranging effects of this discrepancy include black Americans' lack of access to high-quality housing, health care, and education. Racial discrimination. Black people have historically been exploited and dehumanized, which has led to a chronic problem of racial discrimination in American society. This discrimination takes many different forms, such as discrimination in the workplace. Black Americans experience discrimination in hiring, promotions, and compensation, and are more likely than white Americans to be unemployed or underemployed. Housing discrimination. Black Americans have a higher likelihood of experiencing redlining or mortgage denials, which limits their access to safe and reasonably priced housing. discrimination in criminal justice. Even for identical offenses, Black Americans are more likely than white Americans to be arrested, found guilty, and imprisoned. Discrimination in education. Black students are disproportionately disciplined and more likely to attend underfunded, resource-poor schools. The Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was not an actual railroad, but a network of secret routes and safe houses used by African American slaves to escape to freedom in the 19th century, particularly before the American Civil War. The Underground Railroad comprised a network of secret routes, safe houses, often called stations, and individuals known as conductors who assisted escaping slaves on their journey to freedom. Harriet Tubman, often referred to as the Moses of her people, Harriet Tubman was a prominent conductor who made numerous trips to the South, helping around 300 slaves escape to freedom. William Still, an abolitionist, Still was a key figure in the Underground Railroad, documenting the stories of escapees. In his book, The Underground Railroad Records, escaping slaves traveled on foot, by wagon, or by boat, moving northward to states that did not have slavery or to Canada. Abolitionists and the movement to end slavery. Abolitionist sentiments emerged in the 18th century, with individuals like Quakers and religious groups advocating for the abolition of slavery on moral grounds. When slavery was first attempted to end, the transatlantic slave trade was officially abolished in the British Empire in 1807. The Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 in the British Empire declared that all slaves in the British territories would be emancipated. When did slavery end? The American Civil War, 1861-1865, played a pivotal role in the end of slavery in the United States. President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 declared slaves in Confederate-held territories free. The 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, ratified in 1865, formally abolished slavery. Slavery was officially abolished in Brazil in 1888, making it the last country in the Americas to do so. Does slavery still go on today? While legal slavery has been abolished in most countries, modern forms of slavery, such as human trafficking, forced labor, and bonded labor, persist in various parts of the world. Efforts by governments, NGOs, and international organizations continue to combat contemporary forms of exploitation. The fight against modern slavery involves legal measures, awareness campaigns, and support for vulnerable communities. Despite progress, challenges remain in eradicating all forms of forced labor and human exploitation globally. Thank you for watching our documentary on the dark chapter of slavery in human history. We hope that this documentary has shed light on the origins, expansion, and unimaginable hardships endured by enslaved people. We also hope that it has sparked a conversation about the lasting impact of slavery on society and the ongoing struggle for racial justice. We encourage you to continue learning about slavery and to use your knowledge to fight for a more just and equitable world.